we say it over and over, but it rings true, I think, every time we say it, which is that members of Congress are single-minded seekers of re-election. That is, no matter what policy goals, political goals, or other power goals they may have or they may want to achieve, right, re-election is the proximate goal. It's the thing you have to do first in order to pursue any of these other goals. You can't achieve those other goals without first getting re-elected. And that re-election motive, we think, shapes, right, all of their behavior. What do we mean really by that? It means that legislators see major policy choices through the eyes of their constituents, right? Whether it's the question of how or whether to bail out the financial sector, whether it's the question of regulating greenhouse emissions, or, of course, whether or not to fund and on what terms to fund the federal government for even 6 months. Why is that important? No matter the level-headedness and the hard work of party leaders, they have to convince rank-and-file members that what's in the party's collective interest, or, God forbid, what's in the nation's general welfare, is simultaneously in that member's individual electoral interest. Leaders can't just command loyalty from their rank-and-file. Think about the implications here for Speaker Boehner, right? Early on in the battle over the budget, Speaker Boehner and the leadership of the House Appropriations Committee proposed a fairly moderate set of spending cuts relative to where they've come now. A group of freshmen, a group of conservatives said, no, right? That's insufficient given our campaign promises. Conservatives were far more interested in living up to those campaign promises, even if it risked allowing Democrats potentially to brand those Republicans as ideologues and then blame them for a shutdown. There's no getting past these electoral barriers unless your own rank and file see the party's interest as synonymous with their own. And I think that's, well, I'm sure we'll come back to, that's part of the dilemma here, I think, for the speaker, right? How to both please the base of his party and their own electoral interests, and well as to think about the party's reputation or brand name in Washington, given the events of the last week. So first, I think we need to keep in mind these electoral barriers. Second, in terms of other barriers, this partisanship or indelible partisan polarization. By every measure we have, whether it's roll call or other based measures, partisan polarization has climbed steadily and shows very little sign of abating. What is debilitating about partisan polarization is that it reflects more than just policy disagreement, more than ideological disagreement, right? Certainly it represents policy differences between the two political parties, right? But it also represents political differences, right? That increased incentive to disagree with the other team just because it's the other team or the other party, right? That partisan team play amplifies ideological disagreements, right? So we have both policy disagreement and, if you think about it, sort of strategic disagreement, an incentive simply to disagree, right? And clearly some of this comes up in what's going on with this game of chicken over the spending bill to avoid the shutdown, right? Certainly we think these sheer numbers can be compromised, right? Yes, these are difficult compromises to reach, but in the end, it's dollars and cents. But if there's a wing of the conservatives in the House, and if the speaker wants to remain speaker, right, they may have a political incentive not to compromise. Again, why do we care about these partisan dynamics? Right? Clearly, we think it raises the barriers to legislating and raises the barriers for leaders trying to reach compromises. Right? The narrower question about the rest of the federal funding for 6 months, let alone these broader questions about the debt limit, about debt, about deficits, and so forth. And we should think, if we look carefully, that this partisan disagreement, it tends to spill over into issues that aren't strictly red and blue policy issues on themselves. So the foreclosure crisis, for instance, right, if you look at the extent of foreclosures across the country, it hits red districts, Republican districts, it hits blue Democratic districts, and yet there's a fair amount of polarization between the parties, spills over and makes the foreclosure crisis almost impossible to solve.